What is up, everyone? Ryan Ray here inside the war room, alongside, if you're watching, a pink stroller from my daughter. Okay, let's get into today's episode. I have Patricia Fara on, who is a historian of science at the University of Cambridge. She has a litany of books, and I say litany. Let me go through the books that she's published. Science of 4,000 Year History. She's got books on Newton, on Darwin, and a handful of other topics. I will link to her Amazon Associates page in the show notes, so be sure to check out her books. Okay, before we get into the show, let's talk about Ryan Recommends. And so I've got the Five Wide newsletter I talk about quite often. I've read 12 books this month. And so the book that I'm going to recommend, I think now, probably haven't so far, is The War Below by James Scott. If you haven't read that, you like submarines, World War II history, The War Below by James Scott is fantastic. Go check it out. Now, sponsor. Our sponsor is Novo. I use them for online banking, and you should too. If you're a small business owner or a solopreneur and you're looking to bank online, you don't want to go to the bank, you don't want to do all that pesky stuff, Novo is the place for you. I will leave a link to them in the show notes below. Really appreciate them sponsoring the podcast. Now, back to our guest, Patricia Fara. Okay, as I said, she is a historian of science, got a litany of books out about scientists and the history of science. Fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed talking with her and going through what has gone on in science over these past couple thousand years. Hope you enjoy it. If you do, drop a 5-star review, or if you're watching on YouTube, how about a thumbs up? Patricia, it is wonderful to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and I'm very glad to be here chatting with you this afternoon.
Okay, so you have, I was looking at your Amazon authors page earlier, a litany of books on scientists and science and history, kind of commingling all those topics, which is kind of a unique approach. It seems that you're, from your vantage point of how you're covering these topics, what got you focused on this type of history?
I absolutely love writing, and I've always been involved in education. And I've always felt a desire to communicate to a more general public, not just to write narrow academic texts. I was privileged enough to have a very fine education, and I think, in a sense, people in my position have got a responsibility to share the results of their discoveries with people more widely. And I was lucky in the sense that I didn't have an academic job that demanded that I produce so many academic papers every single year. So although I have written academic papers, I prefer writing these more popular books and reaching a wider public. It's much more difficult to write a general book than to write an academic book, but I really enjoy the challenge.
Yeah, I was looking for have an academic book on Hong Kong and China around here somewhere. I was trying to find it, but I was going to point that out that actually it's okay. So it's really weird, right? The academic books, at least for someone like myself, they're a little harder to read, but the irony is that communicating to the general population is actually harder to write, right? That is, it's really weird.
Well, it is, but it's sort of a bit like when I read a student's essay. I tell the students, look, I have to read your essay because I'm either the examiner or I'm your teacher, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make your essay interesting to read. And if you're writing a popular book, the person always has the option of putting it down or not buying it in the bookshop. So you've got to write in a way that's going to immediately attract their attention. So you have to think of devices to get into your subject without starting at the very beginning, or without having too many dates and facts that clog up the narrative.
So okay, so then the follow up that seems to be is, how do you know what the general populace wants to read about?
Well, in a sense, I think I have to tell them what they want to read about.
Okay.
I write about what interests me, and I sort of talk to friends and sort of find out what interests them. And I don't think you can write a popular book unless you're really impassioned about your subject. You really have to be engaged in it. So I've sort of developed subjects that I really want to write about, and I want to really persuade other people that they're important. If it was something that I wasn't particularly interested, I know, like the tax system in 17th century England, I couldn't possibly write a book about that. Other people can, but not me.
Mm. Okay, and so you tackle these subjects like you have a book I believe from 2010, Science: A 4,000 Year History, and like I like okay, I like history. I'm fascinated by it. I would get nervous just thinking about tackling such a broad subject because what do you keep in? What do you take out? What do you focus on? And when you think about history, I was reading a book on John Adams' biography. It's a big long one. I was listening to it, but it's a big long one. It's like 30 hours listening or whatever. And there's certain things that the biographer focused on, and then some things he kind of skim over, like, whoa, hold on, I want to know more about, I want to know more about this, and so I'm always curious how you go through making determinations of what's important and what's not important, because that's not as simple as I think most people think it is.
You're absolutely right. And in a sense, that book was a contribution to a much larger academic debate. About 20 years earlier, I was still a student, and I'd been in a conference, and the subject of the conference was, how do you write a big history? And do you write sort of the old-fashioned ones as celebrating the rise of science? They go from Plato to NATO, and then there's newer histories that place more emphasis on instruments, and there's other ones that concentrate on the role of genius. So I decided then, about 20 years earlier, that I was going to write my own version of history. It's by far the most successful book that I've written in terms of sales and translations into other languages. But it also, as well as including various facts, it also included my beliefs about how you should tell history. So I tried to make it very international, not just dead white men who live in Europe. I tried to have women. I tried to write about the whole range of social classes, not just the big names like Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin, but all the other people. They're called invisible assistants. All the countless other people that are involved in the whole scientific enterprise and contribute to new results happening. So I did not want to write about the inevitable rise of science, because that's not what I believe in. And it's the same with this most recent book I've written about Isaac Newton's career in London after he had written his book about gravity and he was running London's Royal Mint. A friend of mine commented in great surprise, "Patricia, you've written a very anti-capitalist book." And it's right. It was a book that had a political message as well as a historical one. So I always put something of myself, my own beliefs in my book. Every historian does, because you have to choose which facts you're going to tell and which angle you're going to tell them from. And that reflects what sort of person you are and what your own personal beliefs are in how society should run and be changed.
I think that's a fascinating point because if you think about the history that will be told about Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or whatever, you could very much narrow it in on those big names, Elon Musk, or you could pull back out and they had to have a lot of help, right? They just didn't do it in a vacuum. And so when you go back into history, you think about the Reformation, you can talk about Calvin or Luther or someone, but there's a lot more people involved. And the same thing with true of these scientists is that there's a lot more people involved, and it is hard to think in those terms because if you're not an expert on the material, it's much easier to think about, Newton or someone else, and not think about all the little moving parts involved. So wanting to capture that is a well needed reminder for most of us who are thinking about just the names through history.
Yeah, I think, well, if there weren't even any scientific laboratories, any sort of large public laboratories like there are now before the 19th century. So people who were doing scientific research were doing it at home. And that meant that their wives and their daughters were helping them. Obviously, the wives and the daughters never got any credit in the books that were published, but
Right.
they were all doing the drawings and doing the translations and editing and keeping snail collections. They were doing all sorts of things, but it was the men who just got all the credit. And of course, it was more difficult because until the 19th century, women couldn't go to university. So unless they were very rich and could afford a private tutor, they generally didn't have a very good education, but they certainly knew a lot of practical science and were absolutely crucial for what their husbands and fathers were doing.
So, how do the men of those times that are using or partnering with, or however you want to phrase it, their wives and their daughters, how do they view their role in it? So, there's one thing, if I'm hearing you correctly, the history's been kind of told that the men were the ones, because they were going into the office. But did the husbands appreciate the roles of their wives and their daughters, helping them in the process?
I think that depended very much on the husband. I think some husbands were much more appreciative than others. I mean, quite a few of them just regarded it as completely natural that
Mm.
the wives should be their assistants. And I think one of the things which is really quite sobering is when you go back into the past and you read what women have written, you discover that women also felt that they were inferior and subordinate to men, and that their role in life was to assist and to help rather than to take a leading role. So I think it's too easy just to blame the men for suppressing the women. Look, the women and the men collectively believed in differences between the genders in a way that I hope that we no longer do.
And so, would you say that that primarily changed around the Enlightenment in the West, at least?
No, because I think one of the biggest influences certainly in the Anglophone world during the 19th and 20th centuries was Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin sort of made scientific the common prejudice that women are inferior to men. He basically said that over the millions and millions of years of evolution, men and male animals and men have been selectively chosen to do all the things like hunting and defending the property, whereas the women have been adapted to stay at home and look after the children, do all the cooking. So what Charles Darwin did was validate scientifically what everybody's ordinary prejudices were, and I think it took a long while during the 20th century to overturn that belief.
So that raises an interesting question, which is, what can science actually speak to, right? So what range, how far does science go on issues that it can actually speak to? So some of what you're saying is Darwin took this scientific approach, but also you might view that as it could be a philosophical approach to how he viewed these issues. And so, does science, at least historically and in modern times, speak beyond its scope of what it can actually address?
Well, science isn't a thing. Science doesn't have boundaries drawn around it. It's actually very difficult to define science. The best definition is the one: science is what scientists do. And I don't think there's any sense in which science is independent of political and commercial and military and imperial interests. They're all bound together, and there's nothing particularly pure about scientific research, and there's no sense, in my opinion, there's no sense in which scientists are on the moral high ground or even the intellectual high ground compared with other people. So I don't think there is any sense in which science is right or wrong or should or shouldn't do this or do that. Scientists do what they want to do for their own personal interests. And sometimes it's that they just want to pursue research. Sometimes it's because they want to make a lot of money. Or that's why we've got nuclear bombs, and that's why we've got global warming and all the rest of it, because science is not independent from society and from political pressures. It's sort of part of the capitalist regime that much of the world lives under.
Okay, so it's interesting to hear you say that. I was in a conference in Zambia a few years ago, well, 5, 6 years ago now. Anyways, and they were talking about battery technology for solar power, and how they were going to revolutionize Zambia. And I'm not a battery expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I knew enough to know that what they were saying was just by and large pipe dreams. Like, there was no way that what they were wanting to do was going to happen. It was the technology just wasn't there. And there was a professor from a university. I won't say which one. And I was asking him about some of the presentations that were being made, and he kind of went through this long talk about how he's frustrated that more scientists don't reveal where their funding comes from and how that influences their results. It doesn't mean the results are wrong, but his point was that all scientific research, I think, is something like this, you should make very clear who funded it, because that interprets the potential for biases. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's very relevant at the moment. I mean, a lot of people want to disinvest from various companies, like the big petroleum companies, for example, and then they turn around and say, well, they're funding a lot of the research that's trying to slow down global warming. So you're left not knowing really where you should invest and what's worthwhile. I think it's incredibly complicated. And certainly science and politics and the rest of society, they're completely interwoven. You can't separate science out as the pure pursuit of knowledge. It's
Right.
a social activity like any other.
And would you say, historically speaking, it has always kind of had, so obviously on some level this has always been true. Is it more heightened right now, or back 2,000 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 600 years ago, was the problem worse, where it was harder to tell? Is there any read on that from a historical
Oh,
perspective?
I think when you go back, so for example, in the 17th century, when Newton was rising to fame, science was incredibly useful for ballistics, for fighting battles. People wanted to make devices that they could sell. People developed medicines, partly because they wanted to cure other people, but also so they could make money, and also so they could keep their workforce more healthy and so make more profit. I mean, wherever you look, there's profit is involved. When Columbus discovered America and Europeans started going over to the Americas, the main people who went there were traders and merchants who brought back all sorts of animals and plants that could be used either medically or for profit, or similarly when English colonialists went to Africa, what they were interested in was all the gold. They weren't interested in discovering Africa or examining the habits of the local people. What they wanted was for the local people to go down the mines, dig up the gold, and then they would take a whole load of them over in the ships to farm the plantations in America. And that was done under the name of scientific exploration of the African continent.
Yeah. And so if I'm understanding your thesis here, is that no matter where we're at in history, this is always going to be a problem, and the general public should be aware of this. Not really sure what to do with it, at least, but you at least need to be aware of this problem.
It's not really a problem. I mean, it's a basic fact of life that one of the major driving forces of human society is personal and national profit.
When I'm saying problem, let me clarify. If you believe that science is this um, altruistic thing, then from that perspective, it is a problem.
It is a problem, and I don't agree with people who believe in
Right.
science as pure research. I totally disagree with that. And I mean, that's going back. You asked me about my book, Science: A 4,000-Year History, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to write it, to show all these broader factors and influences that are absolutely inseparable from science and its history.
Okay. And so we talked about Newton a few times now, and you said that you write books that interest you, and so you have a book called "Life After Gravity: Isaac Newton's London Career." Um, First off, did Newton invent gravity? Because
Oh, well, that's a very, very good question. Did Newton invent gravity? Um, that's sort of going way into the realms of philosophy. He certainly invented the law that describes the concept
Mhm.
of gravity, but that's rather different. The reason I originally got interested in Newton was I wrote another book about Newton a long, long while ago, in about 2002, I think, or 2004. And the reason I chose to write about Newton was that at that period, gender studies was rather a dirty word. And the idea was that if you were a woman, all you would write about is women's stuff.
Mm.
And I definitely didn't want to be put into that camp. So I deliberately chose the most famous male hero that I possibly could. And I've got a degree in physics. So I felt that I could write with validity about someone like Isaac Newton. So that was why I first got interested in him, just to take the most difficult case and show that a woman could write something about him. My first book was about Isaac Newton, was talking about how his reputation has been established over the couple of 100 years since he died, and how it's changed, and why it is we think of him as a great genius, and what it means to be a genius, and how the implications of that word has shifted. But this latest book is just to talk about the last 30 odd years of his life, which most people ignore. Most people are so hooked on Newton and sitting under the apple tree, Newton being in Trinity College, Newton writing his great book on gravity. And what they completely ignore is that for almost 30 years, he was in a position very similar to the governor of the Bank of England. He was running the London's Mint, which meant not only that he was producing gold coins, but also that he was involved in a lot of economic policy decisions that affected the welfare of the whole country.
And did he rise to this status because of some of his scientific research? Was it a bloodline thing? Was he just a good connector of people? How did he get in this position?
Well, when he was at Trinity College, one of his very close friends was a younger man who became Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was extremely influential. And one of the ways that you get promotion, you get jobs in the 18th century is through patronage. And Newton was desperate to get out of Cambridge, and this friend, who was called the Earl of Halifax, found a very, very nice job for him at the Mint, which earned him about 3 times as much as he was earning as the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge. There's also a great historical debate in which there are quite a lot of missing facts, so there's a lot of speculation, but there is a lot of evidence that Newton's stepniece, a woman called Catherine Barton, whom he was very close to, that she quite clearly was having had an extended affair with the Earl of Halifax, who left her an absolute fortune in his will. So it's very clear that they did have a very close relationship. What's unclear is whether this started before or after Newton acquired his position at the Mint. So there's a great deal of historical debate and speculation about that.
So yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, that it's possible that the step niece was using this relationship to help boost his career, right?
Well, yes,
Yep.
to help. It was possible that Newton, the allegation is that Newton knew about this relationship and accepted the position at the Mint in exchange for keeping quiet about
Okay.
it.
Okay.
But we don't know. I mean, there's huge gaps in correspondence and in diaries. I mean, it's only surmise.
Is Newton overrated in your opinion?
Yes, because I don't think he was a lone discoverer. A lot of the work that he did, as he said himself, he stood on the shoulders of giants. I'm much more, rather than seeing a revolutionary step change version of history, I'm much more in favour of continuity. And he relied for his work on what his predecessors had done. He didn't single-handedly, in my opinion, suddenly mathematise the universe. He was certainly a very, very brilliant man, but I think he brought together a lot of ideas that had been circulating. And in my opinion, if he hadn't done it, one or more other people would have done instead. In fact, he was quite often accused of plagiarism at the time. So I don't think he was a unique person, but I don't think he was uniquely brilliant. I don't think he single-handedly revolutionized the whole of scientific history. That's a reputation that's been built up for him, partly to promote the idea of English genius, as opposed to what was happening in France, where Newton's predecessor, Descartes, was the national hero. So part of it was national tension between England and France.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the Bill Gates or the Steve Jobs or the Elon
Mm.
Musk. They are all building upon what happened before them as well. Now they might be able to captivate it and propose it in a new light or modify technology in just the right way that people go, "Oh wow!" But all of them are building on the shoulders of giants, just like all scientists are. They're all taking what has been done before them, examining it, and trying to figure out how to further their research based upon what happens before. And so, again, it's kind of one of those things that we don't think about, but it's just how it works, right?
Well, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates did make a lot of money, a huge amount of money. During his lifetime, Newton did make quite a lot of money, but by the time he died, a lot of people were still very, very critical of his theories. I mean, I think it's very easy to imagine that 1687 he published his great book, The Principia, and suddenly everybody was converted to Newtonianism. It was not like that at all. It wasn't really until the end of the 18th century that Newtonianism was accepted in France. And the version of Newtonianism we have now, sort of when we think about our physical universe, we think of a deterministic universe, the idea that if you know where every single atom is right at this very moment, that in the future, in principle, you could work out where all of them are going to be. So that's a deterministic universe. It just sort of unrolls and there's nothing anybody can do about it. That would have been absolute anathema to Newton. For Newton, his universe was permeated by God, and God could change what happened. God could intervene from time to time. And there was also this idea of attraction at a distance, that if you've got a big vacuum in space and you've got, say, the Earth and the Sun, that there's some power that somehow goes across empty space and attracts the Sun and the Earth towards each other. A lot of people found that idea absolutely abhorrent as well. So it was not an instant success story. His reputation was very high, but his different people fiddled around at the edges of his theory and changed it and adapted it until they arrived at some version of the theory that is generally held today.
You mentioned Newton's belief that God was involved, maybe more so than is thought about historically, at least for the general public. What role and how has it changed the role of God in science over the years?
I think one of the big differences now is that whereas in Newton's time, Newton himself and a lot of other people thought that the whole point of studying the world, of doing natural philosophy, the whole point was to find out more about God. God was the grand designer, and you could, by finding out how the world worked, you could find out how God had planned the world. So studying the world was in some sense a religious enterprise. Whereas I think nowadays, many scientists are religious, but they don't write about their religion, whatever it might be. They don't write about their religion and their scientific results in the same place. They're sort of regarded as mostly as separate spheres. Whereas Newton's book on the Principia, for example, in the second edition, he added a whole section about God. So you've got what's held up as the greatest scientific book of history, the Principia, and there's a section on God right in the middle of it.
Okay, let's go back to this idea of women in science. Because it fascinated me as you've been talking, kind of thinking about your earlier comments of the women and their role in history, and it goes to a larger point of how hard it is to tell history. And so we might think, okay, we don't need another biography on George Washington because we've got 5,000, but the right historian might pick a piece of the pie that hasn't been told and expose it in a way. And it feels like that's what you're trying to do here with your women in history, saying, okay, we've talked a lot about all these great scientists, these great times in history, but here's a particular angle in which I want to focus on. And so, on some level, thinking about the role of the daughters and the wives and stuff like that is something I haven't considered until I've heard you talk. How do you balance bringing these women and giving them the proper attention without overemphasizing or de-emphasizing their role? So how do you try to thread that needle to where you get it um, an accurate portrayal of what they did?
Well, I try very hard to be realistic about the contributions that women made, and until the 19th century, women didn't go to university, and so, with a couple of exceptions, they really couldn't make the intellectual contributions that men were making, however innately intelligent they were. I think once you get to the 20th century, the situation is different. And I wrote a book a few years ago about a small group of extraordinary women who were scientists, doctors, and engineers during the First World War. And the reason, I'm not a 20th century historian, but the reason I became fascinated with them was I was in an archive at one of the Cambridge colleges, and the archivist showed me this large hand-lettered book which had the names of all the women, about 600 or 700 women who were associated with Newnham College during the First World War. And they were all the women who sat on committees and worked for the Red Cross and made sandwiches and did all that sort of stuff. But the first section of the book described women who were studying ballistics, who were doctors overseas in war-torn areas like Serbia and Macedonia. There were people working on secret codes. There were people working on vitamin decays. Every single chemical warfare, every single sort of scientific aspect you could think of. And so what I did was I immediately went running off to the university library, because that's what all academics do. And I found there were lots of books, mainly by men, about the great male scientists of the First World War. And there were lots of books, mainly by women, about all the women who were suffragists during the First World War, or who worked in factories. But that sort of group, that intersection in the middle, the small number of women who were high-powered professional scientists in industry and universities and in medicine, had been completely ignored. So I just sort of focused on them and brought them to life. It was quite difficult, but I found information about some individual women, and I wrote about those. And I mean, I think my inference is fair that if there were a few women doing that, and there are lots of others whose records have just disappeared. I mean, that's the problem. There are many women who we will probably never find out about, or else just find a name and never know what they actually did. There's a lot of women like that.
So one thing you said there is that the women couldn't go to university in prior days, and so no matter how well studied or knowledgeable they kind of were limited. But what about the correspondence, the chatter, the talk between the wife and the husband? The husband's stuck, and he can't. He's just like, I don't know what to do now, and the wife throws out an idea that kind of helps refocus the way he thought about an issue. Have you come across stories like that?
Well, there's one example, is a very famous geologist of the first half of the 19th century who's called Roderick Murchison, and he ended up being president of the Royal Geographical Society. And when he got married, he said himself that what he really liked doing is drinking and fox hunting. He was very keen on fox hunting, and his wife, Charlotte, kept persuading him to do something more interesting. And she herself went off and studied minerals, and she studied shells, and she became very interested in fossils. And it was her who converted him to become one of the century's great paleontologists. So I think that's a nice example.
No, that's a great story. And so, one more question, just kind of a random historical question here, just thinking through this. We're recording this in 2021. So it's easy. You talk about going down to the library and accessing stuff when you want to look something up. Maybe paint a picture what it was like in the 1600s, the 1700s, when they wanted to do research, they wanted to explore. What was it like back then? Because you couldn't just Google stuff or even go to. I mean, there was probably some kind of library, but it wasn't the same. So how did that work back then? How much different was it?
Right. Well, in just taking England, for example, there were only two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and the syllabus in both Oxford and Cambridge had been established for centuries. It was based on the medieval syllabus, and people did a lot of logic. They learned about Aristotle, and it was only in the 17th century that started to change. Printing was extremely important, so new ideas were conveyed through books. There was also a very extensive correspondent network that stretched across Europe, and there was this sort of imaginary country called the Republic of Letters that allegedly, supposedly, transcended national boundaries. And letters were going backwards and forwards all over Europe, and people were exchanging ideas and discussing them and sending each other results. So that was one of the ways that it happened. And then gradually societies started forming, and people would go to lectures, they would watch demonstrations, and the new coffee houses were opening, and that was an opportunity for men mainly to come together and discuss the latest ideas.
What lessons should modern scientists take from historical scientists and incorporate?
Um, I think in general, to have a very open mind, to be curious, to be prepared for failure. One of the downsides of the way scientific research is funded in the UK at the moment is that you have to apply for grants, which means that in a sense you have to know what the results of your experiment are going to be before you've even done it. And if you think of someone like Crick and Watson, leaving Rosalind Franklin out of the story for a moment, but Crick and Watson were meant to be doing something completely different, and they became obsessed by the DNA, and eventually they published their result, the double helix. That could never ever happen now because everything is so directed and focused and goal driven. And if your experiment fails, that is a result. I mean, if you don't get the result you expected to, that provides you with information. And I think people are too success driven, too results oriented, too application oriented.
Yeah, I was talking to someone last year, and they said the problem with the peer-reviewed study system is that um, it's hard to get a peer-reviewed study of something that fails. Right? It's easier to get a peer review if the experiment is successful. Have you come across that, or any commentary on that?
Absolutely. So actually, there's a very, very good example of the early 20th century when it was just when X-rays were being discovered. And a man in France said that he discovered something called N-rays. It was N for Nancy. That was the university he was at. And he had a complicated apparatus with a prism at the middle, and he produced all these mysterious N-rays, and he published papers about it, and nobody understood what was happening. So someone came and looked at the apparatus, and then one day a visiting scientist came, and while the professor, the guy who discovered the N-rays, while his back was turned, this visitor went into the apparatus and he took out the central prism and put it in his pocket. And then the experiment continued, and everybody said they could still see the N-ray results. And this scientist produced the prism and said, no, look, it's all in your head. It's not actually happening. Now, something like that is really important to discover, to show that all these previous papers that have been accepted for scientific journals were just wrong. And you need to be able to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So you bring that up, and you touched on climate change a little bit, which is a very controversial topic. You know, at least in the U.S. I don't know about that on your side of the pond. What it is?
Of course, it's hugely controversial. We're not sort of quite, that far behind the times. We
No. I mean, I don't. Well, what I've learned is I've got some friends across the pond, and they always are like, "You Americans," they're always giving me us a hard time for how we handle things. So I hate to project on what's going on over there because I don't follow the debates as closely. But it's a weird dynamic. We talk about climate change because you will hear the argument the science is settled, right? And so wherever you come in on the climate change debate, where you kind of have these really crazy extremes on both sides. Some say the world will end in 2 years, or some say that nothing's changing at all, and they'll kind of say the science is settled, and that's a troubling place to be because if you take about the analogy that you gave, first off, that's a very complicated science, A, but B, some of the other points that you've made about motivations, why people are doing stuff. How should we? Because climate change is an important topic. So how do you think about something like that with all of the things that we've discussed?
Well, I think climate change is an excellent example of how science and big business are firmly intertwined. I mean, if people hadn't developed aeroplanes, if they hadn't developed all the industrial products, if they hadn't burnt more and more coal, this would never have happened. And I think that's a huge question that's everybody who supports the scientific endeavor has to ask themselves: is scientific research really the big undisputed success that it's made out to be? I mean, it's the same question basically that people were asking after the atomic bombs were dropped over Hiroshima, only now it's a more global problem rather than a local one.
So if I'm understanding your argument there, you're saying that science, because it develops weapons or pollutants or whatever, there is a negative connotation that has to be weighed. But on the flip side, we have life expectancy. We can travel. I mean, you can talk across the ocean. There's a lot of positive as well. I live in Texas. It gets really hot. Air conditioning, homes. So there's a lot of positive things as well.
Yeah, and you have to balance that. I mean, by having this conversation, we're contributing to global warming because of directly by the electricity that we're using, and indirectly in that we're encouraging more and more people to do research. And I really think, I mean, another example is at the moment there's all these missions to go out to planets that are further and further away to go to the moon. Perhaps we should be spending all that money on alleviating poverty and alleviating illness. And I know it's an old argument, it's a cliched argument, but it's still true. I mean, which is more important?
Yeah, I'm not big. I don't understand the desire. People are like, "Hey, would you go to Mars?" I'm like, No, I don't want to go down Mars. Like, I have no desire to
No,
go to Mars."
we're not going to colonize the moon, whatever people may fantasize. And there's some appalling things that we could be spending that money on, and make ourselves a more, I don't know, it depends how you want to define civilized, but civilized has some connotations of morality in it. And it's absolutely appalling that the direction both our countries are going at the moment is to increase dramatically the divide between the well-off and the people who are far less advantaged. And that gap in England, anyway, that gap is bigger than it was in Victorian times. I mean, we're going backwards, not forwards.
Okay, so let's kind of take the plane into for final approach, since we've talked about planes a few times. A couple things here. Maybe general audience here. We're not a bunch of scientists, so we are your target demographic. Maybe leave us with a few things to think about as we move forward. Whether when we hear science being evoked in the future, what are some things we should stop and go, okay, before I take this too seriously, I need to have kind of a checklist of how to interpret this data. And one thing that I'm always torn over is, so I'll give you an example. I was having a discussion with someone the other day, and they said, "Well, you don't trust the science on this issue." And I was like, "Well, actually, I can't understand the science. Like, I realize I can read the paper and I can read the words, but I have no idea if what they're doing is actual proper procedure, if this is the right stuff, if the results are made up. Like, I can't. I can read it, but I had to trust that they're being honest with their stuff because I have no idea. What I can do is kind of observe what happens and see if that seems to be working. That's about the only real science at that level I can do. Is that a good way to approach science? Think about science. Should we be trying to read more papers? Understand how should the general population think about these issues?
No, I don't think there's any point us as individuals trying to learn more science. Science has become so specialized that even scientists can only talk in detail to a small group of other people. What needs to be understood isn't the scientific content, the formulae, the experiments. It's what the how much the experiments or how much the applications are going to cost, what they're going to be used for, who's investing in them, who's going to gain from them, what the social value is of introducing those innovations. I don't think we need to know, I mean, any more than if you're looking at a balance sheet, you really don't need to understand how the accounts work. What you need to know is the bottom line figure of how much this is costing and what the effects are. Those are the data that you need to know. You don't need to know the scientific equations.
Okay. Other than Newton, who we're linked to your book about him in the show notes, what other scientist from history would you like people to know about?
Well, my current preoccupation is, well, I've got several, but one is Rosalind Franklin. I would like her to be remembered not as the sort of female victim of Crick and Watson. I would like her to be celebrated as a pioneer of virology, because in this time of COVID, viruses are very, very much in our thought, and she was one of the leading pioneers in that area of science. So I would like her to be remembered in a more positive way. My other current preoccupation is a woman who lived from roughly 1860 to 1940, and she was celebrated as the queen of slime molds. And slime molds are strange organisms that are neither plants nor animals, but they seem to act intelligently, but in a very different way from how human intelligence works. And their activities are being used as a basis for new forms of computer programming that can solve problems that conventional digital computers find it almost impossible to tackle.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe some more books in the future are on the way then.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
So.
What's that?
I hope so. Yeah, I would love to go on writing some more. Yes.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Well, this has been fantastic. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. Thank you so much for your time. We'll link to your books and your Amazon author page. Anywhere else that you want to point people to, direct them to if they want to find out more about your work?
No, that'll do. Amazon, and pay your credit card and buy the books. That would be great.
Okay. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it and look forward to hopefully talking to you again when your next books come out.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been fun talking to you. Thank you. We've covered a good range of topics.